studying literature, the pre-critical response. Dear students, we've actually decided to put something from literature as well in this course so that you can have the brief initial idea of doing your researches in the area of literature, right? So as the part of that program, I'm introducing you to an approach in literature which is called the pre-critical response, right? So in this session, we are going to talk about the pre-critical response and how would you use it for your particular research ideas in the area of literature. In literary research, the objectives involved are basically about the understanding of the fundamental theoretical concepts, right? So the idea is that you would think about using those fundamental, very basic level approaches which are used in literature, right? So we'll introduce you to the very basic level of those approaches, and then you can pick up a literary work and you can think about using that approaches, various kinds of approaches which we'll introduce to you and explore that particular literary work for the sake of your literary research. There are many contemporary approaches used in literature, right? And we as researchers, we are required to know them and to use them, and then particularly to use them for the sake of research in literature, okay? And of course, there are differences in various literary approaches, and that's the reason we have a lot of literary approaches, in the trends available to us in literature. So we'll talk about some of those differences which are found in those approaches, right? The differences on the basis of the critical approaches and the literary approaches, right? So those are the points which we are supposed to understand and to discuss for the sake of literary criticism and for the sake of literary research, right? So these are the objectives. We are required to have the knowledge of key forms, right? And those key terminology which are used in literary criticism, right? So the terminologies and those key forms which are used in literary criticism, they must be known to you as researchers, and particularly when you will claim that you are master's students in English, so that you may feel comfortable by using those approaches in your area of literature when you are interested to pursue. And the second objective of using and introducing those approaches to you is that you must be reading literature with understanding and with judicious appreciation, right? So you're not only reading for the sake of understanding, but you can also be appreciating literature for the sake of your understanding as well as for the sake of your research. So these are the objectives that we want you to think about the contemporary approaches which are used in literature and use them in your research areas. So we are going to introduce you to the basic theoretical concepts, right? And the basic theoretical concepts are for the sake of understanding and complementing, right? And the primary focus would be on starting from the very basic ideas in literature, focusing on senses and emotions while reading literature, right? So we are going to talk about the pre-critical approach, and the pre-critical approach is when you are appreciating literature, when you are understanding and reading literature without involving any critical approach, as the term is, like pre-critical approach. So the pre-critical approach is that you are not using any critical approach, but you are actually focusing on your own senses, your own understanding of literature, and your own feelings and emotions about literature, right? So you would be starting up with your own senses and emotions, and that's the starting point. And ultimately, we may go for a bit of detail regarding those well-known critical approaches. But since the major part of this course is related to ELT. We would be just touching upon the very, very fundamental, and basic level which are used in literature, right? So the pre-critical approach is basically the first step to move from amateur to analytical response, right? So when you are not using pre-critical approach, you are just reading literature like an amateur literary person, right? So you are not using any particular, analytical form, right? But when you start using pre-critical approach, then you are moving from the amateur reader of literature to the analytical, and very responsive reader of literature on the basis of your emotions and your feelings and your senses. In pre-critical approach, we are focusing on what, how, and why. So what? The form of literature, right? Or the components of literature. The form of, various genres of literature, right? And then how, like how various techniques, how various, tools are used, how various literary techniques and tools are used, devices are used in order to, to appreciate and praise literature, right? And why. So the why is also there, right? Like, for example, if you are concerned with a particular theme in any literary work, and you want to comment on that particular theme, you may be addressing some questions which are based on why, right? So the focus is on what, how, and why in pre-critical approach, right? So the importance of this pre-critical approach is that there is no substitute for initial personal appreciative response to the basic ingredients of literature, right? So in this approach, which is called pre-critical approach, we would be not focusing on literary theories or critical theories, but we would be just focusing on what, how, and why forms of literature. And as experts say, that there is no substitute to this personal, initial, very appreciative response of literature. So we'll continue with this discussion in the coming sessions.